In a historic first, a German court has found a former Syrian army colonel guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced him to life in prison. The landmark case is the first torture trial implicating the Syrian regime. It was also the first to target atrocities by a government that is still in power. All this over a decade after uprisings against Syrian President Bashar al-Assad began. Survivors of torture in Syrian prisons are celebrating the news, though they say it's just one step in the long path to justice. Omar al-Shugra is one of them. When he was a teenager, he endured 3 years of torture in a secret Syrian prison. This picture shows what he looked like when he was released from prison after his mother paid a bribe. Al-Shugra fled to Turkey and eventually settled in Sweden. He joins us from there. Omar al-Shugra, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to start, if we can, sir, with your initial reaction to this verdict. I wonder how significant this was for you and many other survivors.
So much happiness, so much joy. I was always waiting for the day where we could see results for the work of me and the other Syrian people, the organizations that have been working so hard to actually achieve the first step of justice. It is very relieving to see that happening in Germany.
You were a teenager when you were arrested in Syria, and 3 terrible years. There's no other way to describe it. Physical and psychological torture while you were in prison. And I can imagine it's difficult dealing with a traumatic experience like that, but I wonder, does today help? Does this verdict help?
Mentioning trauma, the most beautiful thing about this verdict is actually proof that we could use the trauma, use our past to achieve things that we never imagined we could achieve, right? So those people who been traumatized literally by what happened to them in Syrian prisons of physical and mental torture, they all came together to actually build a case and drive this entire court to have a verdict. So it's very beautiful and very inspiring, not only for the Syrian people, but for the world, that despite everything you're going through, you still have the power to change something. You still have the power to get justice for what happened to you.
You know, this verdict, this is one person, this is one colonel. You know, there are many regime and military officials who have been accused of even worse crimes and are more powerful than this colonel who's been convicted now. And they're still living freely in Syria, including President Bashar al-Assad. What does full justice look like to you?
So this verdict, or more of this verdict, won't heal the heart of the mother whose heart was broken of her son who been killed in Syrian prisons. It won't heal the wounds of the prisoner who've been tortured for so long time, but it will renew the hope for the Syrian people who've been losing hope over 10 years because of the international community's lack of will to help the Syrian people. Justice there is no whole justice for the Syrian people. Nobody can bring me back those 3 years of my life I lost in prison. Nobody would bring my father back who been killed in Syria, my brothers who were killed, my cousin Bashir who died with me in prison. Nothing can bring them. There's no justice, literal justice, but it's symbolic value for the Syrian people to tell them that your revolution and what you sacrifice is not for nothing. And those who are responsible for crime should be held accountable. At least the ones who had the power to command, to order these crimes, the ones who had the power to order to have torture in Syrian prisons, to turn them from prisons to torture chambers, those people must be prosecuted. And in the top of these people must be the president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. He should be prosecuted, and he should be moved from the seat of power to the seat in the court, questioned for his crimes against the humanity, his war crimes in Syria.
Do you think that will ever happen, though, sir? I mean, President Assad, he's scoring some diplomatic victories, normalizing relations once again with other countries. Do you think you'll ever see him prosecuted for what happened?
I believe that would happen because, you know, Syrians, regardless of all the obstacles that were put in their way, from the Russians to the Chinese to the Iranians to the Indian, all of that, despite all of that, they continued. Despite all of that, they managed to have this verdict yesterday, right? So all of that together shows there is a sign of hope. The Syrian people have been trying, been working hard, and there's always more people coming out and speaking out against the regime. And now after this verdict, there is something very valuable that's happening, is that people are reaching out saying, oh, wow, the witnesses, the plaintiffs are saved. safe, and the result of the court, that means I actually can come with the proof I have. I can come with the story I have to tell my story, to reach the world, and to use more evidence against the regime. Today, we have a lot of evidence. We have the Caesar file, we have the witnesses, the survivors, plaintiffs, and we have the grave digger, the person who was responsible for the massive graves of the people who died under torture in Syria. We have so much evidence. Now we lack the international community. So we want this step in Germany to be an inspiring step, encouraging other nations like the US, the UK, Sweden, Norway, Spain, all these countries around to actually take this step, cooperate together to build even a bigger court that can replace the ICC and actually prosecute people with higher ranking, people with more power, people with more crime, that their prosecution can affect the game on the ground in Syria.
You know, to this day, Syria remains the world's largest refugee crisis. 6.6 million Syrians have been forced to flee the country since 2011. Thousands have settled in countries like Canada and in Sweden, where you are. I wonder, how do you see the future for people who have had to flee Syria, as you have?
Firstly, some countries are trying to talk or discuss or try to send refugees back home to Syria, saying Syria is safe. Syria is not safe. If it's safe, you go to it yourself before you send people. Go and explore that yourself. Syria is not safe. People are still being detained. There are more than 100,000. There's more than 130,000 people who are in torture chambers, being tortured while we're talking right now. Torture. It's painful. Right? It's pain, people dying on a daily basis. And that's what the regime does. There's evidence that people who return for some reasons, they were detained and tortured. And I had a friend of mine, Mazan al-Hamada, who was taken from, who returned to Damascus, was detained, and he's tortured. We just had somebody getting out of prison telling that Mazan was tortured after he returned from Germany. There is no safe place in Syria while the regime is still in power. This regime must fall, must change to allow the Syrian people to return. You have more than 6 million people who are refugees abroad. Those people don't trust the regime. They don't trust that there is, any safe zone in Syria. So those people don't want to return. They can't be forced to return. That's against all the humanity we discuss here in the West. We can't send anyone back. But those people, the most beautiful thing about being a refugee is actually you having the opportunity to educate yourself in the best universities in the world and learn from the experience you have from democracy and freedom you are experiencing in the West, for the hope of returning one day to Syria and implement what you learn and use your experience to build a much better country than what we have right now.
Is that your hope, Omar? I wonder, how is life for you now, and what does the future hold for you?
Life is amazing. I'm enjoying it a lot. I'm studying at Georgetown University, and I'm doing the things I love in my life. I love to work on Syria. It's my passion. I love to highlight the trauma that we went through and how we can change it to a driving force. So I believe life is going very well for me, and I want to use that to change the situation in Syria. I want to educate myself at Georgetown University so I have the tools for the future to change, to contribute, to be a good candidate, to contribute to help my country. Because I believe, despite everything happened, Syria is the most beautiful country in the world.
No, I get it. There's no place like home, right? Omar El-Shugr, thank you so much for your time. Good luck.
Thank you very much.